This is Duke University.
I've been using this shorthand word, and as I've said off and on, the last thing the world needs is a new word. You know, we've got Wiki and Google and all these new, Occupy. Well, that's an old word with a new meaning. But Nuuma Sphere is my shorthand for this phenomenon that's building around the world, which is connectedness. And again, as I said, the ability to sort of move ideas to where they're needed at light speed, or at least the speed of an electron, not photon. But it's just remarkable what's underway. And as a blogger, and I mean, the other thing that's happening is the traditional forms of communicating ideas, like the media, the traditional media, are imploding, partially because of like the SOPA, this Online Piracy Act that you probably learned about today. If you didn't know about it before, was anyone blocked on Wikipedia today? Anyone? Yeah. Or did you see the black thing on Google? You know, I did a piece recently on .earth about is the internet selecting for copiers over creators? So the downside that some people have identified with webbiness is that you don't have to be inventive. You can just sort of appropriate. You can be, it's a lot easier to be the remora on the attached to the shark than to be the shark now than ever before. And I've written about that question, although I still see in the end overall the benefits of this sort of mind expansion of how we can be conscious about things as defeating the downside. But it's an open question. So the Nuuma Sphere, it's like, it comes at me every day of the week. I see some example. And I've seen just at NCSU this morning, I learned about stuff students had done, communicating ideas from the ground up that was fascinating, that you couldn't do, 10, 15 years ago, or let's ratchet way back to 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago. I was in journalism school, 1982, 30 years ago, where, I'm typing away on a freaking manual typewriter, literally, boom, 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 and, cutting and pasting was literally cutting and pasting, all that stuff. And if I wanted to share an idea, I'd had to get it published somewhere and hope that someone would pick up whatever that publication was. In 20 years ago, when I was working in science magazines, if I wanted to find a source, we had a wall of books. It was the Encyclopedia of Sanitation Engineers, the Encyclopedia of whatever, pharmacologists. And I had to literally go through this book and find out the association of people who do something, and then call a phone number, or wait, or, it was impossible. And now it's, again, it's just done. So, and here I was on July 1st, running up a hill in Garrison where I live on a hot day, and I had a stroke. I didn't know at the time. So I ended up, it started out, it wasn't a stroke initially, it was just what's called a carotid dissection. Even if you're healthy, even if you don't have strokiness, like I didn't have strokey, aspects. I'm not type A. Well, maybe I am type A. But I'm not like, when you see a stroke candidate, it's always that person. It's some old, overweight, whatever. Bottom line is, one of my eyes stopped working right. It was like the world was paisley in my left eye, and it was normal in my right eye. So I go to the hospital, but it was 4th of July weekend, and so there was no stroke neurologist on hand, smallish hospital. And so they took too much time in figuring out that I was right in the process of having a stroke. I hadn't had it yet. My carotid artery had shut down for a physical reason, just a little flap of skin in the lining of the artery. And so if I had had anticoagulants, if I had had a smart, trained neurologist on hand at that moment, it's a good chance I wouldn't have had the stroke and spent, a week in the hospital and a month kind of not being able to blog. Oh no! Not being able to move my head. But it didn't happen. And while I was, of course, I blogged the stroke, because my hand was still working for a while. But I started learning about telemedicine, which is this reality today where a stroke neurologist in Phoenix can be on hand in an emergency room on an Indian reservation in rural Arizona diagnosing a stroke, because 90% of a stroke diagnosis is visual. So you can have the right eyeballs in the right place in a virtual way now that was not conceivable a while ago. And think about the efficiency of that. Stroke is the leading cause of disability in America. So, and we have all these stroke neurologists, the most trained people are sitting around most of the time because their emergency room isn't being filled with stroke patients 24/7. But they're somewhere, And every time one isn't diagnosed rapidly, that's a lifelong disability, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost productivity, let alone medical costs. So I learned about stuff. Oh, you know, is there a sound? Actually, I should play you an interview. I think, let's see if your sound system is on. If not, I'll just keep it quiet. I met a guy, well, I didn't meet him. I kind of met him. Here, I'll just do it this way.
I'm in Santa Barbara, California. So you're in Santa Barbara, California, but I'm in Long Island. And you've heard
I'll explain who he is. He's an inventor. He's an engineer who came up with this system that's kind of like Skype on steroids. And it's a mobile device that can come to your bedside in an emergency room. It's like it looks like it's out of the Jetsons. You know, he's explaining what that's about. It actually is beneficial to have the mobility that he can control from his end. He's doing that. He's in Santa Barbara. I'm in Long Island for this interview. And he's able to zoom in. He actually shows, you'll see in a second, he can zoom in on my face. So you can see the feet, like whether my eyeballs are dilated differently and stuff. So if this system had been in that emergency room, I wouldn't have, you know, I'd have a much better chance of success. So the moral of the story is we're at this amazing juncture, and you could apply this in so many different ways. I'll show you a couple of other examples related to earthquakes, and obviously related to education and climate or energy or whatever. The bottom line is we've never had the greater ability to get the right mind in the right place at the right time, and or together. And the innovations, you know, when I write about innovation on .earth, most of the time it's about a better battery design or a better wind turbine blade or that kind of thing. So we always think about innovation in terms of invention, a new genetically modified crop. But it's also innovations like the following. The impediment to having this in every emergency room, it is a little costly, but the benefits, the overall economic benefits are vast. I guarantee you, if you run the numbers, it's a benefit more than a cost. The impediment is administrative. So we need administrative innovation because the problem here is that under Medicare and virtually every insurance policy follows what Medicare does. Medicare only allows a doctor to bill for services when the doctor is physically at the patient's bedside. Hands-on medicine, which you can see historically why that would be sensible. You know, you don't want fraud. You don't want these. There's many instances I used to see in the New York Times of some doctor in Harlem who would be billing, you know, vast amounts of money for people he never saw. So you don't want that. But that happens anyway. There's ways to actually, it'd be easier to prove that this person was somewhere because you have the digital record. But the reason this isn't everywhere is because simply we don't have the norm yet for this virtual expertise to be billable. And that implies to me that there's great opportunities for innovation to advance prospects for human affairs in this century that don't involve just engineers. Engineering obviously is involved. Science is involved. The expertise in medicine or in whatever. But also you need to think of new ways about systems. This is all system stuff. The avoided cost is huge. The short-term cost is insignificant comparatively. But how do you overcome those behavioral social norms is an interesting question. And it means that these challenges and opportunities are not just for the PhDs and the hard sciences, they're for everybody. Political science, economics, etc. And you know, I don't know if you can see these pictures very well. Maybe we can dim the lights a little bit. This was the end of the Copenhagen negotiations in 2009. This was a cameraman in the press center there had 3,000, I don't know how many reporters, thousands of reporters. And everyone was completely burned out. And you could see, whether you're a reporter or a campaigner or a delegate, there were people all around like this guy. So everyone's had that feeling lately. And then you look at trajectories for human affairs right now. This cartoonist from a Santa Barbara newspaper, he no longer works there. See, newspapers used to have cartoonists just like they used to have science writers. Now he's on the web. So Steve Greenberg did this cartoon a while back about population. You know, yeah, I love this. I think I can. I really hope I can. World food. It's about can food keep up with population? And obviously this goes well beyond where science now thinks we're going to settle in mid-century, roughly 9 billion. But even that's a question mark. But you get the idea. So we're on this it's hard to look at graphs like this and not feel like the guy in the last picture. And it's hard to look at scenes like this. This is a photographer at the New York Times doing the annual sort of send the photographers to Walmart or Target in this case for the Black Friday picture. You know. And of course now, I don't know, Black Friday is now Thursday. Everyone ratcheted it forward to Thanksgiving Day itself. So can you imagine 9 billion people doing this as a norm? 3 shirts for $15. Let's go. How does that happen? So it's hard not to feel dispirited. And in writing about this on .earth, this moment, I keep coming back to one theme, which is that we don't seem to have distinguished ourselves from bacteria on a plate of agar very well yet. So far, we just look kind of like this. And it's like we're just going and going, and science is sort of saying, hey, the agar is not infinite. There's an edge to this is agar and bacteria. I mean, bacteria and agar too. And the science is basically saying there's an edge to the dish. Hello, everybody, there's an edge to the dish. But we're still in kind of go mode. And of course, the world is not equivalent. Some of us are very established bacterial colonies that have been drawing on fossil fuels as our agar for a century or more, and some are just getting into gear. So it's like a slinky. One end is already way over here. The other end's just getting ready to fling forward. So you look at all that stuff, and you still say you feel like a photographer at the climate talks. And as I said, scientists, I think, are particularly burned out. Here's Martin Parry in 2007 at the rollout of the IPCC, the Working Group 1 report in Paris, and saying, and we know this, we know this, we know this, and we know this. And society is like the young man in Rebel Without a Cause. We just don't want to hear this. I've used the theme of adolescence on .earth quite a bit. That we're on Teen Planet right now, not just because there's a billion teenagers on planet Earth right now, which is a scary thought in itself. I mean, there were only a billion people in 1800. Now there's a billion teenagers. But we've been in our adolescent fossil fueled instead of testosterone fueled kind of pubescent growth spurt. And the scientists are like the grown-up in the room going, if you keep this up, you're going to drive off the cliff, like he was telling James Dean. And we don't want to hear it. And an articulation of this came up in the climate discussion in the Supreme Court in 2006 when James Mielke, representing the state of Massachusetts, he heard Scalia say something that was technically wrong about the atmosphere. And so he's respectfully, Your Honor, it's not the stratosphere. I mean, it's the troposphere. Justice Scalia says, troposphere, whatever. I told you before, I'm not a scientist. Laughter. That's why I don't want to have to deal with global warming, to tell you the truth. Now, it's easy to look at this and say, well, he's just this conservative Luddite, guy. But there's a big chunk of everyone that just doesn't want to have to deal with global warming, to tell you the truth. It's an undercurrent, and I don't know how many of you talk actively about these issues with neighbors, with people who are not studying science, and it's hard, it's complex, it's laden with implicit uncertainty, layers of it on both the what's the problem and what do you do about it, and it's a someday somewhere issue. No matter how hard it gets pushed as a here and now issue, it remains a someday somewhere issue. The worst impacts are somewhere else and someday else, and we are really bad at that stuff. Look at the debate over the national debt, let alone or Medicare insolvency. And you see there's some categories of problems that we're really bad at. And they usually involve something that's somewhere else or someday else. And we have that put-off ability in our deeply rooted in how we behave. And so circling to the media, which came up at the beginning here, let's see, you're mostly, you're all graduate students or mostly? Okay, so you're mostly creatures of the 20th century still. But when I talk to younger, like undergrads, most of their lives now have been in the 21st century. They didn't grow up with Walter Cronkite. They didn't even grow up with Wolf Blitzer. So when I was a kid, every night we would have our dinner. My dad would come back from the furniture store and we'd turn on the nightly news over our spaghetti or macaroni and cheese or whatever. And someone told us that's the way it is. And it was like so easy, we didn't have to think. We just just had information handed to us by the media. The New York Times front page is the same way, very authoritative. Here it is. Write a letter if you remotely peaked, and maybe we'll publish 4 of them. So it was a one-way process. It was a handoff. It was authoritative. And now we're in this realm where if you care about something like climate, by the way, back then it all found, it wasn't accidental that dinner was the nightly news was dinner. It was like a big comfort food meal. It was just sort of, here it is. Now we're still dining on comfort food, but you can all have your own comfort food, whatever you like. Sushi, curry, ham and cheese, sandwich. You can go out on the internet and find world's biggest buffet and find your niche, your comfort zone. So which is better? I don't know. I don't think either one is better. I think the old idea that the news was just handed to us had deep flaws, which came out in, remember the run-up to the Iraq War was a perfect example of how the news process can go astray, including at the New York Times. And this has got horrible problems because it's making us all in our little comfort zones, where we're just sort of butt up against each other, the different comforts. The skeptics are over here, and the believers are over here, and the disengaged are nowhere anyway. They don't really care. And so there's problems, but overall, I'll try to make the case that I think still this webbiness, this noosphere would be a beneficial place. And I'm just going to, these are actually semi-wonky. I think that universities particularly, and schools in general, including elementary and secondary schools, high schools, can play an important role. They basically form the architecture, the skeletal underpinnings of this thing. And it's not, I thought two or 3 years ago, I was thinking to have to build something like Wikipedia, but better, something where you have portals where if someone needs a piece of information, they can go there and find it. But more recently, I realized it's kind of just happening. It's not, you don't have to build anything, you just have to create intentionality. That whether you're a student or a faculty member or staff at the university, if you just build in intentionality, awareness, and the ambition to connect, to reach out, to build bridges, to do what the media are no longer doing, to be the portal and the sharing network for ideas, you can have some progress, some sense of progress. And again, universities are natural hubs for this kind of thing. Because the schools there's a physical hub to a university. You have a campus, which can be a laboratory for demonstrating best practices, whether it's on energy or growing food or transportation. So you can demonstrate to the larger community, assuming that you have sort of an open relationship with the community around the school. You can actually serve as a laboratory. And of course, it's a forum. It's like a place where people still do physically meet, which is great. You have to have some of that, along with Skyping. I just Skyped in with it's day 1 of my documentary class at Pace. So I had to come there by Skype from NCSU. So you have the physical hub where students and the community around them, including businesses, can convene and solve problems and look for opportunities. And this is just one example of at Harvey College. They have their Center for Environmental Studies, and you probably have stuff like this here too, where they demonstrate regionally appropriate landscaping using indigenous plants. Great, this is how you can do it. Show, or just tell. And then networking, building those bridges through long-distance portals like Skype, so you're co-learning with students in Ghana or China or a poor community that isn't nearby, or just having a collaborative relationship with other schools. I'll show you one example that we did at Pace last year, where the documentary we did last year involved 3 different universities contributing content, because I just sort of reached out through normal networks of friends I knew who are journalism schools. We sort of collaborated. There are some very interesting examples that have come up recently of young enterprise. This was AtlanticRising.org. It was interesting. It's kind of a project that's done. Some young British recent graduates who were interested in climate went on a field trip. Essentially, they went around the Atlantic and they did little demonstration teaching projects with students in schools and coastal communities, where they're studying the impacts of sea level change on coastal situations. And then they also did Skype exchanges, so that students in Ghana were talking to students in Scotland, where they're very similar communities in terms of geography, and they're starting to get this common sense of Atlanticness. We Nantucket. They were there at a meeting on sea level rise in New England, and they were doing these demonstration projects with local students. Where this basically this is what 3 feet of sea level rise looks in your area. I think it's very, very beneficial, smart stuff to do. Now, all that networkedness and stuff is really cool, except of course we live in a world where not everybody is networked yet. And I don't know if you've visited .earth much, but I've posted this picture probably 3 or 4 times now the last 3 years. It was taken in Guinea, and these are kids who are off the grid for the most part. They live in slums outside the capital city there, and to do their homework at night, they don't have electricity. They have to go walk to the airport parking lot and sit under the streetlights. So they're kind of like moths, you know, every night they come to the airport parking lot. And this picture, you can actually build a semester-long course on this picture, because it's about energy poverty. It's about the importance of energy. It's also about gender, because does anyone see any girls studying there? No. So that's another issue. And by the way, the first time I posted the picture, I didn't even take note of that. It was like 6 months later, I realized, hey, look, there's another issue here. And so I wrote about that. So you can say, well, oh my God. And what's really terrible about this, of course, is these are kids who are already in school. They're engaged. They want to learn. They want to succeed. They want to build better lives. Or they wouldn't be there studying. But they have to go to an airport parking lot to do it. That's just as devastating to me as the over-carbonized energy existence that we have. This is easily as important a priority for me personally as the other end of the carbon energy chain. Now, that is changing. This was Libby Rosenthal, a science writer at the Times, went to Kenya a year and a half ago and did a story about these little enterprising initiatives. Like, this is a woman who got really tired of having to go into town once a week to charge up her cell phone battery. Because cell phones, they're a lifeline. They're a bank now, as you probably know. And not to mention, they can give you your crop price before you go to market, so you don't get ripped off as a jerk. So she got one of these $60 panels, put it up in her rural village. She had surplus power, so she started charging her neighbors' cell phones for a modest fee, much less than they would have to pay going into town. And her kids have electric light at home. And her neighbors, she was making enough money that her neighbors realized, oh man, this is cool. They started buying these little panels too. And so they're putting her out of business, but at the same time you can see how that's like a little flash fire spreading through that corner of rural Kenya. And it just shows you the outsized power of a few kilowatt, not a few watt hours, let alone kilowatt hours. This is where solar is such a no-brainer compared to plopping a costly panel with an expensive subsidy that is indirectly paid for by taxpayers into San Diego. This is really, these watts are priceless because they change lives completely. And yeah, these kids, you know, they're doing their homework. Compare this to the kids sitting in the Guinea parking lot, and you can see what's going on. Cell phones, I mentioned, but I can't not show, this is one of the most powerful slides I've seen that illustrates what's happening with information flows right now. Way back in 2000, there were only 700 million cell phones or so. The majority were in rich countries. Now there's 5 billion as of a year ago. It actually must be close to 6 billion now. And 3/4 of them are in developing countries. And I don't know if you've charted the prices of smartphones, but it's going down really fast. So very soon, momentarily, all these billions of people will be able to, in some way or other, I'm saying this not in a literal way, will be able to basically listen into those free online MIT courses or Duke courses. They'll be able to tie into the intelligence network that used to be this privileged domain of a very small group of people. And so that is a wonderful prospect. And boy, I never thought, I really love soccer and stuff, but it turned out that the World Cup, when the World Cup came to South Africa, that was the biggest advance for connectivity in Africa ever. Any idea why? Because Europeans were desperate to have a lot of bandwidth to connect so they could watch 24/7 all those matches. And so a cable was laid from Europe through around the east coast of Africa down to South Africa. It was a $600 million project. It was privately financed. 3/4 of the financing was African money. So this is not philanthropy or anything. And that cable was there to put in bandwidth for the World Cup. But it had so much extra bandwidth that all the countries along, except for Somalia, along the east coast of Africa are now tapping in. And you can go online. The name of the company is Seacom, S-E-A-C-O-M. And just look at, and I've written about this on .org as well. It's a stunning increase in bandwidth for a big chunk of Africa. Which is greatly going to reduce the cost of being on the internet. And that's greatly going to increase the prospects for the internet being a meaningful part of people's lives, not just for business, but for education and other purposes. It's really an amazing development. And it was completely unexpected. No one really thought that through. Oh yeah, wow, when we're done, think of how that's going to empower East Africa. Didn't work that way. So that's what I mean by Nuuma Sphere. And the word is a direct allusion to Nuuma Sphere, N-O-O-S-P-H-E-R-E, which was in the early 20th century, the 1930s, Teilhard de Chardin, a theologian in Paris, and a geochemist in Russia named Vladimir Vernadsky, both kind of came together as convergent intellectual evolution on the idea of Nuuma Sphere, which was planet of the mind. That they were foreseeing that we would end up with this, Earth would have this sort of sphere of intelligence around it, intelligent life, that will, from that point forward, modulate and regulate and help sustain the planet, theoretically. Now, again, as I've said before, that can cut in two directions. But I just love the concept. This was all kind of very allegorical and really philosophical, but now we're sort of building out that wire. And some of it's wired and some of it's wireless. But it's happening. And the question, and I think a lot of the turbulence we've seen around the world related to information, you think about everything from ClimateGate to the spikes you see in commodity prices. Remember, there's a lot more turbulence now than there was in the old days, because when the crowd jumps on an opportunity, everybody jumps. It's like on a crowded boat. If everyone rushes to one side of the boat because they just spotted a whale, you can have a lot of instability in a boat. So right now we're in that moment where this is all just unfolding, that there's a lot of that. There's a lot of boat rocking and turbulence and uncertainty. But I think in the long run it's going to be a very good thing. I really started to realize this when I was actually doing some reporting on earthquakes, which I've written a lot about virtually every kind of disaster, from near-Earth objects hitting the Earth to climate change to earthquakes in vulnerable places. And Istanbul is one of the more vulnerable places in the world. Vulnerability to any disaster is a function of the number of people times the hazard frequency and intensity. And Istanbul is a sitting duck. It's on a series of faults that are really bad news and that have given way periodically through history. It's actually etched in the art of Istanbul. This was, I think, 1509, and you go back, there's a guy in, I think he's in the Czech Republic, and he has a collection of art of earthquakes. Everyone's got their niche, And I forgot his name, so he provided me with some of these. And there's a sequence, so it's like 1 year it's a woodcut, and then it's a lithograph, and then it's a photograph going forward in time. But it's the same image. It's people under collapsed buildings with fire. And there'll be another one. The problem, of course, for Istanbul and for many places around the world is it was one thing back then when there were probably 100,000 people in Istanbul to 1950 when there were 1 million. And now the Istanbul general area has 15 million people in it, mostly living in insta-housing, stuff that just was built up almost randomly. You see buildings there that are perpetually a work in progress because people will add the rebar in the top of the house, presuming when their children get married they'll have an apartment up above. It's really amazing. So I started to try to learn about what Istanbul is doing for the next earthquake. And this is the same issue with climate. The issue is how do you get out ahead of the disaster? How do we act now to limit risks from something we know is coming, or in climate there's other issues with what we know and what people think we know and don't know. But earthquakes, you don't even have that. With earthquakes, it's absolutely given that this city will be hammered by a 7 or 8.0 earthquake in the century. I mean, basically it's a given. So even then, though, we don't really do a lot. And it's not just in places like Istanbul. The Pacific Northwest faces an epic earthquake and tsunami threat, and it's not adequately prepared for that. So here's a kid that I met going under his desk on a drill, which is great. And I met a lot of kids. When you go as an American reporter into some quirky part of the world, whether it's the Amazon or Istanbul Kids kind of all run around, ask for your picture, and usually they come up to you and they're saying like, American, or they're trying out some word they know in English. You know what these kids are all asking me? Facebook? And I kid you not, and I'm thinking, wow, this is interesting. The first time that happened, I was like, what the? And then I realized, because I was in a poor part of Istanbul, they didn't have computers at home, but they had them in their community center. And they're, a lot of them are playing, they're on Facebook or on, and they look like my kid, my 13-year-old boy. And there was a couple who were playing Farmville, and he touched on Farmville. He's more of a Minecraft kid now. And I saw this, and I thought, I immediately had this, like, so all you need is a translation interface that's smooth and efficient. You can have kids in different parts of the world playing together, and then, of course, the leap from playing to working together is a very short one, or collaborating, or just being aware of each other is a short one. So, of course, a number of these kids are now my Facebook friends, which is kind of cool. I mean, I'm not, like, regularly in touch with them, but it shows you that what's happening in the world is the sort of, it's frictionless. Frictionless. There's no friction now involved in getting information to a new place, or sharing insights, or sharing fun, or whatever. And then think about back when I was 13 years old in 1968 or so. I had to scribble one of these. I had a pen pal in West Cameroon. I don't even think there is a West Cameroon now. And it took weeks. I'd send him a note, and he'd send me back one, and it would be in the mail. I'd be really excited, that kind of crinkly paper. But now it's all there. It's all just ready to be exploited and tested and experimented with in ways that no one has really adequately appreciated yet, I think. Getting back to earthquakes and schools and vulnerability, we're in a world, and not just with earthquakes, but with urban floods, landslides, you name it. There's never been as much vulnerability to natural hazard as there is now, because there's so many of us and we're so congregated. And this is just a quick map to give you, what is this? Each circle is, there's the chart, 10 million. These are kids, school-age kids in earthquake zones. So, mind-boggling level of exposure. Of course, that doesn't count the teachers, who are also rather important to all the teachers in the room. And we are not very good at building buildings, especially buildings like schools. This one looks pretty good. But we often build buildings that are just guaranteed to pancake in shaking when you have lateral motion. And you see this over and over again, boom. I had to write about what happened in Sichuan. This is one of those schools in Sichuan province in China. And these kids all died in that school. And that's just one class. And there were thousands and thousands and thousands of kids who died in that earthquake. And the one that's going to happen in the Pacific Northwest is, let me just quickly say, there are 1,000 schools in the state of Oregon that have already been deemed by engineering analysis to be dead ducks. They're going to collapse when that Cascadia fault gives way. So, it's like with me with strokes. Remember when I told you strokiness is like something else? And we always think of earthquake vulnerability, but they're in China, it's okay, it's like their tragedy. But if it happens in Oregon tomorrow, and 200,000 kids happen to be, if it's during the school hour, and we have tens of thousands of American kids dying, then you wonder. But we're not really adequately pushing to smarten up on those systems, on getting those schools girded. So this sort of goes back to the Nuuma Sphere, though, because I'm going to show you something in a second that's very relevant. There's an earthquake engineer at Purdue named Santiago Pujol, who cares about earthquakes because he's from Colombia originally, the country. And he has come up with a design for a typical school structure that employs no different materials than would be typically used in India or Kathmandu or anywhere else to build a school. It's bricks and basically reinforced concrete. But he just changed the configuration of the building in a way that makes it fundamentally safer. Not guaranteed, but a lot safer. So my son, my 21-year-old son, created an animation using After Effects to show this is the vulnerable school, like the ones you just saw. So now he's going to play it backwards. And with a simple design change, just doing that, and you'll see in a second why that's important. This is a shake table. This is a three-story tall building, made on a shake table at Purdue. You can see how basically the masonry moves with the columns and helps reinforce them. Instead of when you have a half wall, it actually increases the vulnerability of the column breaking. So what I would like to see is for that no-brainer design, which is not a matter of language even. Just showing that little video around the world would be a great thing through networks to, of course, the reality is in most developing countries, there isn't an engineer or an architect involved in construction. It's just someone putting up buildings. So you have to find ways to build that into the general culture, that there's ways to use the same materials, no different costs, just change practices and you have a safer building. And remember, we're going through the biggest building boom in history right now. Something like the next 30 years, we're going to build more structure around the world than has been built through all of human history. And if they're built smartly, bravo. If they're built stupidly, a lot of avoidable losses. Remember, that applies to energy efficiency. You can think about how many aspects of a building you could tweak in simple ways right now if you got ahead of that curve. What an opportunity that is right now if you're in design or engineering to make a difference in the world. And sometimes it's old-fashioned stuff. Roger Billum, who's an earthquake expert at the University of Colorado, he and others created a series of simple posters that show you sort of smart practices and not so smart practices for mixing concrete, for doing rebar. Rebar is the reinforcement. This is the good stuff. You want 3-to-1 aggregate to cement. And you want to do these little loops. These little loops are so important in buildings. If you just have the spaghetti strands inside a column without those loops, then you're a dead duck. So little practices make a difference. This is bad. So basically it's bad, good. Bad, good. That's all you need. And then remember, community then could go out and punish severely the guy who did it the wrong way if you ended up with a disaster. At Pace University, this course, I co-teach a course now in documentary production where every spring the students travel somewhere on spring break. Like usually the kind of place they would want to go anyway, sit on the beach and have a pina colada. So the idea was to take them somewhere where they'd want to go anyway, but then to do something interesting with the film, make a film. So we went to Belize last year because I got involved, and to do a film on shrimp farming. And this woman, Linda Thornton, is moved from the States to Belize in the 1980s, and she's been working for decades on ways to reduce the environmental impacts of shrimp farming, controlling the amount of food. You move the water from one pond to the next pond and then back again instead of letting it out into the nearby mangroves. You use land that's already degraded. You don't obviously pull those mangroves. And it's been fascinating to tell the story of how she's worked there. And it was really marvelous. And this is another thing that the regular media never do. We don't tell good news stories. We only go to Thailand and tell you about the terrible practices. We never highlight in the media, the conventional media, the good practices. That's right. So someone can do that, and so we're doing it. There were some other students at University of British Columbia who did a documentary. They went to Thailand and did the bad stuff. So you have to do both, but the opportunity is bigger here, I think. And that's all over YouTube and Facebook and stuff. And as I said a minute ago, we ended up collaborating with the University of Colorado, George Washington, University of Virgin Islands. They all contributed content that went into this film. And they're all in the credits, and it was a great collaborative project. And I think that form of storytelling or collaborative project-based work, whether it's in science or journalism in this case, can really lead to some interesting outcomes. Because we could suppose we had 10 or 15 schools around the United States that wanted to collaboratively explore fracking, the future of natural gas in America. You send your teams out, they do a lot of interviews with sort of best practices, worst practices, transparency issues, work with the faculty and the sciences on, like what they've been doing a lot at Cornell and Duke, on what's up with the gas and the chemicals in the ground. And just produce a big database that's common and everyone can draw on to create output of various kinds. It's a new model for both science and storytelling. I think it's got a lot of potential. And then there's all these opportunities that go begging. we're in a world right now where public school teachers in science particularly, have no resources, no time. They're saddled with all these obligations about having to get the kids to perform on tests. And then there are all these young communication students who are sitting around trying to come up with ways to demonstrate how to use the tools that they're learning in journalism or communication courses. So there's some very fun examples of people who are filling that gap. Some students in California a few years ago created this film on geoengineering.
Geoengineering is something global, intentional, and unnatural. And we've got some smart fellers figuring out new methods. Let's look at a few. Space mirrors. In this lifelike reenactment, Eric is the sun, and Patrick is the earth. As Patrick orbits Eric, he receives some of Eric's solar radiation, making Patrick very warm. Let's see what Patrick has up his sleeve. By deploying space mirrors, Patrick deflects some of Eric's warming radiation, making himself comfortably cool. Fire near the Galapagos. This is a scale model of the ocean. What you got there, Patrick? Looks to me like a handful of rusty nuts and bolts. Let's see what happens when you fertilize the ocean with that iron. Algae blooms. Drinking
It's
in
spelled algae wrong. So everyone needs an editor. and you know what I think would be great is to have sort of a Match.com where you have science teacher needs a little explainer on greenhouse gases. Students at another school say, here's one, and then people critique it. Say, well, what about this? And then they redo it. So you have that learning and doing practice. You could have a lot of interesting content created that way through that kind of portal. But right now we don't have a common portal. And as I said at the beginning, I used to think we need some new hub, whether it's a website called learnhub.com or Nuuma Sphere.org or whatever. But ultimately I don't think we do. It'd be nice to, I think the Match.com aspect of this is just, again, about intentionality. Schools through Twitter, all my courses now require students to get on Twitter. And you can develop a conversation around the subject, and whether it's science explainer videos or anything else. And so you can have that interactivity and that sort of who needs what kind of outreach without a new thing. And just one last thought is about multimedia, or telling a story in a multimodal way. And you think about, when I grew up in journalism, some people had this poo-poo attitude toward photography and graphics, like, well, it's like garnish, you don't need that. Just tell it in words. And if you can't tell it in words, you're really not being a good journalist. But neuroscience has shown us that basically we see words, hear words, think about words, and we speak words with different parts of our brain. So if you're not sort of engaging the whole brain and looking at the question, whether the question is how does a greenhouse gas work, or how do you prevent an earthquake losses, what's the best tool for the job in conveying that information to the world in a way that will stick. And I think when you do that, you start to see real opportunities also here. So I can tell you the volume of the atmosphere at sea level pressure, X number of cubic kilometers, or I can do what Adam Neiman did a few years ago. He's an illustrator in the UK, science illustrator, who said, okay, well, we can calculate that, but here's what it is. This is the atmosphere, all the air in the atmosphere at sea level pressure. So obviously the air in the stratosphere is less dense, but if you put it at a common pressure, that's the volume. And I think this kind of illustration is a good starting point for any conversation about a global commons, in this case the atmosphere, especially as we head toward 9 billion people, having to sort of parse that out. And for the oceans, it's the same thing. This is all the world's liquid water, if it would put it in a sphere. Just peel it off the oceans and just take all that water and sphere out the shape and all the rivers. And of course, then you run the thought experiment. Okay, class, what would be the size? What would be the spherical volume of all the world's fresh water? And of course, it's too small to even, you wouldn't be able to see it there. It's so small. And that is like an aha moment. Okay, so freshwater resources are scant. And I think it's a good way to engage on an issue like that, rather than in an abstract way or just trying to scare people. And there's nothing about any of this that's preachy or it's information. It's just raw information, just presented in a new, creative way. And I think, again, there's great opportunities to do all that. And that universities, again, kind of fill the gap. Pace has a big connection to Thomas Berry, the environmental writer and theologian, and he wrote this at one point. I propose that the religions are too pious, corporations are too plundering, governments too subservient, universities should have the insights and the freedom to provide guidance needed by the human community. I mean, that's everybody in this room and the other campuses around here. So it's a responsibility and it's such an opportunity for everybody right now on these subjects. Now, this is one last one. This was New York, NYU did this film. Anybody seen this? So you get the idea. And it's another way to engage. And you can have a debate. You know, people can say, well, yeah, but that's only that one town, and in most places the water, the aquifer is not near where the fragment is, and but it's a starting point. These are like a starting point for conversation. But it's a way to get into audiences that might not otherwise be used. So I think it's great. And I just like to end with the old Carl Sagan thought. Remember, Dot Earth actually started. The name and everything for me derived from Sagan's speech in 1996 or so. Was that around then? Cover the dot. And so we're all there, and I'm here. So really easy to find. And that's it. Thanks. And I'm happy to.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.